Okay, welcome everyone. My name is Wen Akins, and I'm the Reading Room Assistant at the Library Company of Philadelphia. If this is your first time attending a Library Company event, we're so happy you could join us. If you've attended another one of our programs, welcome back. For those who may not be familiar, the Library Company of Philadelphia, founded in 1731, is an independent research library concentrating on American society and culture from the 17th through 19th centuries. Free and open to the public, the Library Company houses an extensive non-circulating collection of rare books, manuscripts, broadsides, ephemera, prints, photographs, and works of art. Our mission is to foster scholarship in and increase public understanding of American history before 1900 by preserving and interpreting the valuable materials in our collection. To that end, we host a wide range of free public programming, which is what brings us here this evening. Launched in 2020, when the Library Company was physically closed due to COVID-19, our Fireside chat series continues as a platform that sustains and celebrates our diverse community of fellows, scholars, librarians, readers, and lifelong learners. Each chat highlights the extraordinary work of researchers who have drawn on the rich collections of the Library Company, and tonight is no different. Tonight, we are thrilled to welcome former fellow Katherine Johnston, who will be presenting on their recent book, The Nature of Slavery, Environment and Plantation Labor in the Anglo-Atlantic World. If you have questions during the presentation, I encourage you to use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screens or to put those questions in the chat. We will address those questions after the presentation. And so it is now my pleasure to introduce Katherine Johnston, who is an assistant professor of history and philosophy at Montana State University. Her research focuses on slavery, race, and the environment in Atlantic plantation societies. Johnston is the author of The Nature of Slavery, published by the Oxford University Press in 2022, and her current research investigates wet nursing, race, and visual culture surrounding women's bodies in the colonial Atlantic. It analyzes tropes of femininity and motherhood, particularly in the context of Atlantic racial slavery. And so without further ado, Katherine, you can take it away.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Wynn and Allison and everyone, and thank you all for being here. I'm excited to talk with you a little bit about my book. So I'm gonna share my screen with you, I think. And tonight, I wanted to talk with you a little bit about my research for this book and how I conducted that research and my questions and what I found. And I welcome any questions. So I started with a question that it seemed really simple as an early grad student, and obviously is way more complex, but I was interested in how contemporary societies, especially places like the US, developed a concept of racial difference. And what I had read was that in the late 18th and early 19th century, scientists developed the fields of anatomy and biology and phrenology, right? And that these divided people into racial categories. So I am a historian of the Atlantic world, right? So I study especially this region with plantation societies at the heart of this region, kind of in the Caribbean and along the coast. Right, these are located in the Americas, but directly tied to both Africa and Europe through the exchange of people and goods and commodities. So it seemed to me like ideas emerging from these Western European societies about race must have come from people's experiences with bodies, right? African bodies, European bodies, Indigenous American bodies in plantation societies. And again, I'm specifically looking at kind of the Caribbean and the Low Country here. And so even more to the point, I came across material, including material at the Library Company, that pointed me in what seemed to be a clear direction, right? Which was that at the end of the 18th century, both Parliament in Britain and Congress in the US considered abolishing the transatlantic slave trade, right? And planters from the Caribbean and from the US South insisted in these debates that only enslaved Black people could do this labor, right? They're essential to the maintenance of plantation societies. And these planters argued that these were the only people who had bodies who could labor in hot climates, and that ending the slave trade, which would be a likely precursor to abolishing slavery, would devastate these plantation economies. And they argued that white people were physically incapable of labor in these places, but that Black people could easily work in the heat. So planters' claims suggested that they had observed Black and white bodies in hot places, right, and noticed disparities in their ability to labor, which would be tied to disparities in their health, which would then lead to concepts of race. I thought they must have seen white people dying while Black people thrived, right? And that these observations would lead to their claims. So I went to the archives, a lot of archives. I read a lot of letters, right? All these letters written from the colonies. And all of these letters, I kept looking for places where people would talk about differences in health between Black and white bodies. And what I found instead, anything related to health also had to do with the weather and with rain, right? So I found quotes, of late we have had more rains than sufficient, which has, I am sorry to say, been the cause of much sickness. The constant rain has made the parish sickly, white as well as Black. Many both white and Black people, but especially the latter, who are more exposed to the inclemency of the weather, were getting sick, right? And so the evidence of race and racial difference just wasn't there. So I thought, okay, well, what's the deal? So I went back and looked more closely at documents, more materials. And what I found was a history of colonists and planters and slaveholders using a rhetoric of climate to justify and advocate for and demand African slavery in the Americas. So what do I mean by this? Oh, those are the citations, right? I want to talk about this in three parts today. So first, I want to talk about, just briefly, the ancient origins of climate theory. And then second, the development of this rhetoric to justify slavery. And then finally, the legacies of this language. So to begin, here, just briefly so you can know, the top left is Barbados, top right is Antigua, bottom is Jamaica. This is really quick and dirty history, and I can go into it more later if people are interested. But stretching back to Aristotle, there are these theories in Europe that the Earth can be divided into latitudinal bands, right? And that they're climatic bands, right? There's the frigid northern and southern poles, and then the temperate middle zones, and then the torrid zone, right, where nothing can thrive and no one can live because it's too hot. And these theories evolve a little bit over time, but by kind of early modern Europe, they're still kind of thinking about that your climate is latitudinal, and the climate that you're in determines your health, right? And so if you're used to the temperate zone, you can't go outside of that because it's going to disturb your health. And there's nuances in that too, but this is the very broad brush strokes. By the 17th century Caribbean, obviously Europeans recognized that people can live in the torrid zone, right? That things thrive there, plants live there, people live there, but there's still this fear, right? Like, can a Northern European live and be healthy in a hot climate? And this is kind of setting the stage for what's happening in the early 17th century when colonists start moving into these islands, right? And as they start moving in, they're bringing white laborers with them. The labor force is mostly indigenous and white at this point, so like 1620s, 1630s, right? And they're cutting down forests and they're trying to clear land for plantations. As we get into the 1640s, the sugar boom happens in the islands, right? I mean, and the labor force begins to transition to mostly African laborers. And this happens for a couple of reasons. Mostly availability. There's political unrest in England and Scotland. There's navigation and trade laws restricting this trade. So a lot of servants were coming from Scotland, but now England and Scotland have a harder time trading. Meanwhile, there's more availability of African laborers. The workforce in the Caribbean changes to mostly African. I should say that this has nothing to do with the climate. It has everything to do with availability and political situations and economics. And that throughout the 17th century, even as this is happening, you have white slaveholders and white planters consistently writing to England, to Scotland, demanding more white laborers, saying, please send us more laborers, please ease these regulations and these laws. We really want more white laborers. But several things are happening, including the development of a poor reputation for climate in these areas. And that happens for a few reasons. And I'll just very briefly, this whole section is super brief, talk about a couple of things that happened. One is the English tried to take Jamaica from the Spanish, and that is known as the Western design, right? That happens mid-century, mid-17th century. And when the troops arrive, they don't have enough food, they don't have enough water, they don't have shelter, they have all of these basic needs that they haven't met. And so a lot of them are getting sick and a number of them are dying. Back in England, it becomes easy to blame this on the climate in general, right? Like this is proof that white people can't be in hot climates because they get sick and die. The second thing that happens near the end of the 17th century, 1692, there's a pretty significant earthquake in Port Royal, Jamaica, which is like the main British settlement there. And again, what happens is there's lack of access to clean, fresh water, lack of access to food, medicine, shelter, and people get sick and die. But again, the kind of public narrative is these hot places are unable to support white bodies, right? And so what you start to see is the development of this rhetoric, sort of, okay, hot places, white bodies can't go together. And what happens is this is in spite of the fact that there's increasing number of white settlers in these places who are living there, some of whom are laboring there. But some officials begin to realize that this climatic language can be a really useful rhetorical tool, right? So they start writing things. So for example, from Barbados, right? I'm persuaded to believe I'm sick, right? That nothing but my native air can restore me to a perfect state of health again, right? So Richard Dutton, he might have been sick. I mean, I'm sure he was sick. He may have believed this, fine. So he asks to go home with him, right? I'll never recover my health perfectly in this continual hot and moist air, but must return to my native country. But there are several examples, and this is just one of them, where people start to use this language for other reasons, right? So Charles Cox, I desire you to procure His Majesty leave for my coming to England, alleging it's for the recovery of my health. For here is no living under such management, right? He's really frustrated with his situation. And he's like, I'm just going to say it's for health reasons, right? So his leave is granted. But there's other people that do the same thing. And they say sometimes like, I need to come home because I'm sick, or you could pay me more money. And then they're like, okay, we'll pay you a little more money. And they're like, oh yeah, I'm fine, right? So you see the development of this climatic language, and people begin to realize how you can use this. So I want to talk about how this developed in two places. First in Georgia in the 1730s and 40s, and then second in legislative debates in the 1780s and 90s. So first, Georgia, right? In 1731, a group of people in London called the Trustees decided they want to establish this new colony called Georgia. It's going to be different from South Carolina to the north, right, which is characterized by vast land owned by wealthy planters and worked by enslaved laborers. They're mostly growing rice. And the trustees say, no, we want to have a society of worthy yeoman farmers, drawn mostly from unemployed people in Britain. And so the trustees decide to create some rules for the colony, right? They're like, this cannot be a corrupt place, and therefore it can have no alcohol and no lawyers. But most important was a restriction on slaveholding. Unlike every other British American colony at this point, Georgia would be a society without enslaved Black laborers. The trustees thought that the presence of enslaved laborers would hurt the work ethic of small farmers who would be disinclined to labor. So this, just a view of Savannah from across the river. You can see it's like early stages. These new arrivals faced problems almost immediately. So the settlers had no experience farming or cutting down trees. And as you can see, there were a lot of trees. A few of them cleared and planted their lands, but they're discouraged by all the insects and the vermin that are eating their crops. And they're nervous about unfamiliar animals, right? There's alligators, there's bears, there's panthers. But most discouragingly, these settlers report that there's a lack of trustworthy servants in the colony. They complain that some run away, others, they're like, they conspire to rob us. Some smuggle rum from South Carolina and spent their time in a constant drunken stupor, and others refuse to work altogether. Right? One man actually complained that one of his servants drowned and the other one stabbed him with a sword, right? Although he survived the attack, he lost the servant who died in prison. So there's this one group of settlers who historians call them malcontents. Contemporaries sometimes call them Grumbletonians, which I sort of prefer. But they begin to bombard the trustees with complaints about laborers. They're like, servants are too expensive, and South Carolinians get enslaved laborers much cheaper, right? And this is just not financially sustainable. The trustees are unimpressed. They don't want to see Georgians get wealthy. They're like, yeah, we don't care. So the malcontents keep complaining, but they begin to change tactics. They start to argue that white people are physically incapable of laboring in Georgia and they need enslaved Black people. They wrote that while robust enslaved Africans worked in the sun, quote, with pleasure, their frail British bodies dropped dead in the fields. The trustees are skeptical of this because they actually have ample evidence of Europeans laboring in Georgia from the Salzburgers, who were 25 miles upriver from Savannah. So the Salzburgers had come from Germany in 1734. They proved to be excellent workers, right? In the first few years, they produce corn and peas and potatoes and rice. And for the trustees, these abundant harvests proved that industrious white workers could produce crops in Georgia from their own labor alone. And the Salzburgers start to respond to the malcontents' complaints. They don't want enslaved laborers either for the same reason, right? They're from this religious sect, and their leader says, enslaved laborers are going to hurt the work ethic. So their leader says, look, we can work in this climate. He says, Georgia is, quote, not so very hot as idle and delicate people endeavor to persuade themselves and others. Meanwhile, the malcontents send the trustees a petition signed by over 100 inhabitants of Savannah saying they need enslaved Black laborers because white people can't possibly do this work. As it turned out, several Savannah settlers had ulterior motives for this. So they wanted to introduce slavery to the colony for personal financial gain. The idea was this. So there's this one guy, Robert Williams, and he had begun selling rum in the colony, and his brother-in-law abandoned his land in favor of practicing medicine. And the two of them had almost everyone in the colony in debt to them for either medicine or rum or both. And they used this debt to coerce Savannah residents into signing the petition that white people could not work in Savannah. So they had family ties to, Williams had a brother in the Caribbean and a brother in Bristol, and he wanted to become a slave trader in Georgia. But he knew that most settlers could not afford to buy enslaved laborers. So he said, okay, I'll take the titles to your land in exchange for enslaved people, with the idea that he'd become this large, wealthy landowner. But to do this, he had to persuade the trustees to allow slavery in the colony. And when the economic arguments failed, he turned to the climate argument. The trustees actually don't buy this. They keep the ban on slavery, but Savannah's population begins to dwindle. The malcontents decamp for South Carolina, but they exert continuous pressure on Georgia's residents not to grow crops, right? As one resident put it, the malcontents discouraged Georgians, quote, from laboring and cultivating their land, lest they should be examples that men can live and support themselves without slaves. So finally, in 1751, Parliament took control of Georgia and allowed African slavery in the colony. And to outsiders, the experiment in Georgia appeared to prove that hot climates required Black laborers. Right, so later histories of Georgia in the 1770s and 1780s told the story of the colony's early years in a particular way. So according to these histories, the experiment with white laborers failed because they couldn't stand the climate. Although this is not, in fact, what happened, it became the standard narrative of Georgia's history. And then when the issue of slavery appeared before Parliament and before Congress, slavery's defenders drew upon this varnished history as proof that white people couldn't labor in hot climates. So I just want to pause for a second here and note the difference between public and private sources here, right? So the public sources are all saying it's impossible for white people to labor in these climates, and the private sources tell a much more nuanced story about what's actually going on. But in the end, right, the argument that white people were unable to labor in a hot climate perpetuated and justified racial slavery across Atlantic plantation societies. The Georgia colonists manipulated the climatic language to suit their economic purposes, but from the outside, the story seemed to confirm that the region is too hot for white people to work the land themselves. So the second piece of this I want to turn to is debates in Parliament and Congress in the 1780s and 90s. So the sort of advocates for slavery in these places made unequivocal arguments, both in the Caribbean and the US South, that white people could never labor in a hot climate, right? They'd say, few white planters, this is Grenada, right, can bear exposition to the intense sun of this climate for a few hours with impunity. And Jamaica representatives say, the nature and constitution of a European are not well adapted to retain life in this climate. And South Carolina Congressman Smith says, the South can only be cultivated by slaves. The climate, the nature of the soil forbid the whites from performing the labor. In Parliament, there's this extended debate over this issue, and this committee tasked with the potential abolition of the slave trade asked questions, right? What about white people born and raised in plantation societies? Can they do this work? And the planters are like, impossible. They're like, okay, well, what about free Black populations? Do they need to be enslaved? And they're like, it's impossible. They're like, so why are so many enslaved people dying if they're so suited to this labor? Planters, of course, blame enslaved people's behavior for their illnesses and start saying, oh, it's because they're going out at night and they're doing all these things, right? And it's a whole other thing. But again, here you have the distinctions between public and private. So for example, the plow. Here's the plow, right? So there's one guy, Simon Taylor, he's a planter in Jamaica, and he's writing this public letter that's supposed to be read to Parliament, to a friend of his who he also works for. And he says, okay, you say a question has been asked about working by Europeans in Jamaica and how it is managed by plowmen. He wrote, I know of no white plowing man working by themselves. They may indeed, for the first day when they go on an estate, hold the plow for half an hour or so to show the enslaved people how to hold it upright. But I never saw a plow going in my life held by a white man an hour. So, okay, half an hour, right? But his private correspondence tells a different story. To the same person, later he writes, it will be necessary for you to send out a good plowman if you can get one that has been used to plow with cattle. Right? The people we want are those that have been bred up heartily in the country on poor meager fare, been used to work hard and get up early. Therefore, we prefer Scotch young lads to any others. right? So he's like, in one letter, he's like, oh, it's totally impossible. Maybe they can work for half an hour. And then in his next letter, he's like, yeah, please send people out, right? He's obviously not going to send people out for half an hour's worth of labor. So again, you see these distinctions between public and private, but these debates end up over the slave trade solidify this rhetoric of climate and race. And threats to the slave trade cause planters to draw upon these ancient theories of climate and health and labor and bodies. And they even slaveholders start claiming that no white people had ever labored in warm places. So what happens is, as planters justifying racial slavery insisted that white bodies could not labor in the heat and that only Black bodies could cultivate lucrative plantation crops, this notion becomes ingrained in the public consciousness on both sides of the Atlantic and establishes itself as a maxim in the new United States. So in terms of legacies, I'm going to talk a little bit about short-term and then long-term. So in the short term, from the earliest sessions of Congress in the 1790s through the Civil War in the 1860s, defenders of slavery repeatedly invoke this tenet of climate, labor, and race to uphold racial slavery in the US. They insist that Black bodies can endure hot climates while white bodies cannot. And the implication was that if each body only suited a particular climate, those bodies must be different internally. And during the 19th century, this argument emerged repeatedly in a variety of political and social contexts in the US, right? So slaveholders, politicians, activists, journalists, and others all utilize this argument when it serves their interests, often relying on it to do different kinds of symbolic work. So those seeking to maintain slave labor on Southern plantations drew upon the climatic argument to warn of economic devastation and the collapse of civilization if racial slavery were to be abolished. According to this narrative, those who supported ending slavery would contribute to the deaths of white people who would be forced to labor in an inhospitable and deadly climate. In this portrayal, racial slavery was essential to the very foundation of the United States, and without it, the nascent nation would fail. So in the US, Congressman Smith, who we saw earlier, argued that colonial Georgia had, quote, failed because it didn't have slavery, right? And this is part of a specific retelling of Georgia's history. Especially in the 15 years or so leading up to the Civil War, politicians and newspapers repeatedly assert that Black people could labor in the South, but white people could not. So for example, in 1856, an editorial from a newspaper along the Indiana-Kentucky border declared that the Black man is the proper laborer for these hot climes. He flourishes under them while the white man degenerates and dies. And a few years later, a physician addressing a crowd in Macon, Georgia, argued that the history of Georgia proved that, quote, no white man can ever work with impunity in this climate. No race but the African can ever stand the burning heat and fatal miasms of the rice fields and of the cotton fields. Secondly, the debate over the expansion of slavery in the US, white politicians used the climatic argument to sanction the extension or rejection of slavery, right? So as the US expanded, Congress debated which places would have slaves as they became states. And politicians in these cases sometimes represented the rhetoric of climate and slavery as a supposed law of nature. So the, quote, great climatic law, as one politician put it, dominated some of the most heated debates over the extension of slavery. White politicians argued that places with climates conducive to crops usually grown by enslaved laborers, such as cotton, would naturally invite slavery, while places with colder climates would, quote, naturally discourage or exclude slavery. But this logic demonstrates how deeply white Americans had internalized climatic justifications for racial slavery, along with the implicit assumptions they made about about climate, race, and labor, because politicians automatically coupled Blackness with labor in warm climates, right? And these longstanding and repeated climatic arguments gave rise to the development of a language naturalizing the relationship between race and climate, sanctifying the bonds between slavery and climate as a supposed law of nature. So by presenting this relationship as natural, white politicians made it appear as though the question of slavery was out of their hands. It's not something that can be regulated by human law, but it's subject to a different set of laws entirely. Black Americans reject this climatic law as nothing more than a poor excuse politicians use to release themselves from the responsibility of prohibiting slavery. Right, so for example, California petitions for statehood in 1849, and politicians argued that its mountains naturally excluded slavery. Black activists pointed out that this natural exclusion would actually not stop slaveholders from bringing enslaved people to these places, and that in fact, white settlers had already begun bringing enslaved laborers with them. But while politicians across the US continue to try to toe the line by supposedly leaving slavery up to climate, Black activists pointed out that slavery and climate, in fact, had little to do with each other in any natural sense. Right? Slavery existed in all latitudes. Cotton grew in other places in the world without slavery. Some places that had once had slavery had since abolished it. And so slaveholders made a conscious decision to hold enslaved laborers. There was nothing natural about it. But the language of climate and slavery and nature was ubiquitous. It even found its way into Mississippi's Statement of Secession from the Union, where they wrote, "None but the Black race can bear exposure to the tropical sun." So this is pretty established. But then, then after the Civil War, this is like so amazing, right? With abolition, slaveholders needed to attract laborers, so they start catering to whites by claiming that any ideas that white people couldn't labor in the South were conjured up by malicious Northerners and were completely untrue, right? So one Houston newspaper called the idea that white people couldn't work in the South, quote, "manifestly absurd and demonstrably false." Another Georgia paper lamented, quote, "the mistaken ideas and prejudice that white laborers could not work in the South." And another argued that whites could easily cultivate cotton, sugar, tobacco, and rice because they're so adaptable. So, quote, "Northern speakers and newspapers had produced the conviction that the South was no country for white laborers," right? But actually, this is a malicious misrepresentation. And then they return incredibly to the history of Georgia and point to the Salzburgers. And they're like, look how easily white people can labor in the South. They totally could do this. So all of this is happening, right? But the long-term effects really, this has been this rhetoric that's developed over such a long period of time, right? And that ultimately, by naturalizing theories about climate, race, labor, and bodies, slaveholders and politicians both supported slavery and promoted ideas about biological race. The climate language had been presented as a maxim for too long, right? And the rhetoric about climate and bodies were too difficult to dislodge. And over time, arguments that white people could not labor in hot places and that these places required Black laborers became not just an excuse, but an explanation for racial slavery. And the result was a validation and a deepening of the idea that Black and white bodies were fundamentally different from one another. Because if bodies responded to climates in different ways, they must have some deep biological difference. And this leads to, right, ideas about biological race. And so slaveholders' insistence that Black and white bodies were suited to different climates drove an Anglo-American concept of race as immutable bodily difference and justified further exclusion and separation in the aftermath of slavery. The climatic rhetoric perpetuated notions of biological race and remained an explanation for slavery long after emancipation. Right, so this climatic rhetoric, it solidified at the same time as white anatomists searched for differences in bodies and constructed a sense of biological race and racial difference supposedly grounded in nature. historians centuries later, right, like well into the 20th century, assumed that these differences were the initial reason planters turned to enslaved Black laborers. But if we think back to the letters, that there's clear evidence that physicians, planters, slaveholders, colonial residents all thought bodies responded to environmental conditions in the same way. And both sets of bodies got sick. Some lives are just more valued than others, right? But this language of nature gave white people license to exploit Black people's bodies beyond slavery, and justified placing people of color in situations dangerous to their health by leaning on the idea that Black bodies are particularly suited to demanding labor in unhealthy places. The climatic rhetoric ultimately became a shortcut to supporting racist labor practices and environmental racism. Planters in the West Indies and the US South deliberately placed Black bodies in dangerous environments and specifically sought Black laborers for these hazardous spaces. This sustained and systemic behavior exemplified environmental racism. So I talked really fast here, but if you fell asleep or if I talked way too fast, I just want to leave you with 3 takeaways. First, the difference between public and private sources tell us really different stories. Second, environmental racism, which scholars tend to think of as being like a more recent phenomenon, has deep roots in racial slavery in the colonial Atlantic. And finally, planters' language defending slavery naturalized bodily difference. It made it seem like biological race was this natural thing. So I'm happy to take questions or repeat things more slowly. Thank you.
That was excellent, Catherine. I don't think you talked too fast at all. It was amazing. And let me just go ahead and ask the one question we love to ask everyone. Can you tell us a bit about, and you kind of mentioned some of them already, can you tell us a bit about the library collections that you found particularly useful in doing this research?
Yeah, so I'm
so sorry to interrupt, Catherine. Would you mind just stopping sharing your screen briefly so that folks can see y'all a little easier? Thank you.
Yeah, sure. So the library company has a bunch of material related to these, especially to these debates, right, in Congress and in Parliament. There's this whole pamphlet war that happens related to these debates over the abolition of the slave trade. And people start writing pamphlets, they're producing books. So there's abolitionist press, there's anti-abolitionist press, there's like all of these things. And so the library company has a really rich collection of this stuff. And so you see people writing saying like, I was there, this is impossible. I was there, this is impossible. So for example, like the former governor of Barbados writes in and he's like, there are plenty of white people who do their own planting in Barbados, right? They're not wealthy, they don't own people, and they're sort of forced to do this work themselves. And I can show you through the example of them actually doing it that this is not impossible, that this is in fact possible. And so a lot of the debates around what is and isn't possible for bodies that happen in print, that's one of the main collections I looked at while I was there.
Great, thank you. I'm going to pull a question from our Q&A by Alfred Cavallari, which was, do you know how were the Georgia malcontents recruited? Did they sign up willingly as free wage earners?
Yeah, so a number of them did. So it was a number of them signed up to say, yes, we will go. There's a lot of inducements for them to go. Some of them are like, okay, you get this much land per, free white man who goes, this much land per woman, per children, per servant that you bring, right? So you have these people who are going, they're paying their own passage but they're going because they're getting free land, right? And then you also have a group of people who are going who are not I mean, they're sort of given this option, right? Like, okay, well, you don't have any money or any job right now, but like we'll send you as a servant, kind of indentured servitude, right? We'll send you as a servant to Georgia, and you'll work for somebody for a certain number of years, and at the end of that, you get something, right? Sometimes they're promised land, sometimes they're promised money, sometimes they're promised other things. So most people, right, there's this sort of myth that it's all convict labor, but it's really not. It's most people are going either as servants because they don't have anything, or because they're like, oh, I don't really have a lot here, but I'm gonna get land when I'm there. Like there's some people who have like there's this one guy, and he's got a relative, an uncle in Scotland, and he has a small shop, right? Like a store. And he's like, I'm going to go set one up in Georgia because this is a good economic opportunity. This is going to be a new colony. I'm going to set this up like this. So most people went willingly.
Thank you. And another question from Allison, actually. Did you notice any gendered element to the creation and advancement of these racist environmental theories about Black people?
That's a really good question. For the most part, gender does not really come into this. They're not arguing so much about gender, in some sort of slightly convoluted ways, a little bit, to the extent that they're saying things like, enslaved women are behaving badly, and therefore they're getting ill, and they're not reproducing, and they're not sustaining our labor force in this way. But they also say enslaved men behave badly, right, and become ill, and therefore are not able to do the work that they're supposed to do. But for the most part, it's really racialized, and there's not a lot in there, less than I expected there would be, about gender.
And we have a comment that I'm going to read. I'm not sure if it's a question or maybe you want to respond to it. But it is, I've heard that when Philadelphia experienced its various epidemics, Black people were recruited to be nurses, grave diggers, etc., by alleging that they were less likely to become ill or die.
Yes. Okay. Well, I actually have like a really long response to that one, but maybe I won't talk for 20 minutes on it. But yes, so this relates to ideas about malaria and yellow fever. So there is this notion, right? So some historians will say like, oh, well, actually so they're two separate things that I should take separately. And I want to address the malaria one, even though that's not what this person is more talking about, yellow fever, but I want to address the malaria one anyway, because it's super important. So some people have said like, oh, well, there's some populations of African Americans who have resistance to malaria because of the sickle cell trait. And I find this deeply, deeply problematic for a number of reasons. So first of all, no one talked about malaria or noticed it or categorized it as a disease in this period. And so so it seems really dangerous to diagnose the past, right? Because there's a lot of symptoms that look like other symptoms. Second of all, the rates that I've heard for contemporary, which is something like, somebody quoted me this the other day, of 1 in 14, which I don't know if that's true or not. But first of all, there's no way of knowing that would be the same rate then. And second of all, even if it was, if you have like 14 people and 13 people are getting sick out of those 14, you're not like, oh, gee, everybody's so healthy, right? Like this is like a high, even if it's a very small percentage, that doesn't mean anything. And especially the evidence isn't there, right? It's not in the letters like, oh, we see this difference, like Black people are healthier at all. It's just not there. The yellow fever is really interesting because up until the 19th century, well, first of all, yellow fever is also hard to diagnose in retrospect, and it was tricky then too for all kinds of reasons. But there's there's this distinction that people talk about between being a newcomer to a place or being seasoned to a place, right? So it's like, if you've lived in this place and you are used to the climate and you're used to the diseases, you're seasoned to it. And so you're less likely to get yellow fever. But if you're a newcomer, you're going to get it. And that can be from anywhere. It can be from the Caribbean, it can be from Africa, it can be from Europe. That is like kind of the way that a lot of people are thinking about this. In the 1740s, this one guy writes a letter in South Carolina and he's like, I don't know, it seems like maybe Black people are less susceptible to this. Nobody really pays attention to this until the 1790s in Philadelphia, right? When Benjamin Rush is like, oh, it seems like maybe Black people are less susceptible because this guy said this like 50 years ago. And so he does recruit the Black population in Philadelphia to say, okay, can you do this work of caring for other people with yellow fever? And then he's like, uh-oh, it turns out that they really are susceptible and are not immune at all. But by then, like a lot of them have died, right? And so, but then into the 19th century, there's this confusion about race versus like being a stranger or a longtime resident. But really in this whole period leading up to it, there's a lot of sense that like, if you're a newcomer, you can get yellow fever. And if you are a longtime resident, then you won't. So that's, I guess, I don't know, an answer to a comment.
That is a great answer. And we're going to switch gears a little bit. I have a bit of series of questions from Alfred that I'm going to read. And so let's start. The first one is, was the aversion to slave labor out of fear that it would hurt the work ethic of free white laborers rather than out of concern for the immorality of slavery or concern for the enslaved? And then I'm just going to read the others and we can circle back if you want me to repeat any. But the next two seem connected of, I don't understand the motivation of the guy whose public letter made the case for Blacks being able to work in the hot climate, but then privately writing home saying, send me white laborers from Scotland. What did he get out of claiming Blacks could take the heat? In other words, he's importing whites anyway. Does he think people won't notice that he's claiming the Blacks are the only ones who can work there?
So yes and yes. So basically, yes to the first question. It's absolutely nothing to do with the immorality of slavery. It's totally about, how is the presence of enslaved laborers going to affect white workers, right? We want them to have a good work ethic here. That is really the only concern that the trustees have. The guy who wrote saying only Black people can work here and then also send me white laborers, he does think that no one will notice, right? Because he's sort of importing people quietly and not in huge numbers, just a few at a time, right? Versus the transatlantic slave trade, where there are millions of people going on this slave trade and, thousands and hundreds of thousands going to the Caribbean. And that by saying that only Black people can labor there, he is sort of saying, yes, please don't tell anyone that I'm actually bringing in a couple of white laborers because I really want to preserve the slave trade, because the majority of my workforce are Black laborers and I don't want to lose them. It doesn't mean I don't want white laborers too, but I certainly don't want to lose access to enslaved Black laborers. And so he's trying to preserve the slave trade because he relies heavily on enslaved Black laborers, but he also has some white laborers that he thinks no one will notice.
Right. And I have our second to last, or maybe second to last question. It says, are you familiar with Richard Allen and Absalom Jones' pamphlet in the Library Company collection?
Yes, and they are, right, they're sort of prominent Black Philadelphians who are writing and saying, you said, you white Philadelphians said that we could do this labor of not getting yellow fever, not getting sick, and removing people and taking care of, you know, people sick with yellow fever, and it turns out that our community is really hurting, right? That our community is hurting because we got sick, because we get blamed for all kinds of things. We got blamed for taking advantage of a situation that we definitely did not take advantage of. We got blamed for, you know, that we somehow charged exorbitant rates for our services, which we didn't do. Yeah, it's a really powerful pamphlet.
Absolutely. And so we have no more questions in the Q&A, so I'm going to jump over to one of the questions that I have that kind of goes back to the resources. But, you know, you've just discussed this great archive of personal correspondence and colonial records and these archival resources. But I'm wondering if there are any contemporary online resources or digital humanities projects that, you know, aided your process that you'd recommend to other students or scholars looking to learn more.
Oh, that's such a great question. A lot has developed since I did this research. You know, when I did this research, you couldn't take photographs at the British Library. You couldn't, like, there's a lot of things that had me kind of trekking around to dozens of different archives and keeping notes in a very disorganized fashion. But now there is a lot more that's digitized. So a lot of the research I did for the 6th chapter, which uses a lot of newspapers, is based on digitized newspaper collections. The personal correspondence, some of it has been collected and published. For example, I think, you know, a lot of Simon Taylor's, who I use, his correspondence is collected and published, although I read the microfilm versions of it. And I'm of two minds. Like, mostly I think that this is great, that so much more is available digitally. And also, I think if I had just done research digitally, I would have missed a lot of things that kind of just popped up, right? Like if you're in the colonial archives at Kew and you just have a box like this that says Jamaica, and then you flip through and there's just random papers in there in no order, or they're classified differently, or like they say, like, you know, if I'm looking for what people are writing about the health and the climate, that's not going to be how most letters are classified. So it's not going to be like it's something that's keyword searchable. It's just going to be something random in someone's personal letter. And it's hard enough to read handwriting in person. I find it even harder to read it on the computer. Yeah, but let me think a little bit more about particular collections and get back to you on that one.
Great. I'll definitely be sending a follow-up email. So it's been fascinating. We have one more question from Alfred, just before we go, wanting to confirm that you know, the idea of Georgia being founded as a penal colony is not accurate, and wanting to confirm that the imported labor was overwhelmingly free. Is that correct? Yeah. Okay. So I think, Alfred, I hope that answers your questions. And we are about 4 minutes away from 8. Does anyone have any last questions they want to shoot in the Q&A? I'm going to give it a few seconds. I think we might be good to go. Katherine, thank you so much for your time tonight. It's an amazing talk.
Well, thank you to everyone who was here, and thank you guys very much, both of you, for hosting and for moderating. I really appreciate it.
Of course, and just so everyone knows, you'll see in the chat that, you know, we'll have our next Fireside chat on June 15th on medical independence with Dr. Sarah Naramore. You can register at those links. And I believe this talk will be uploaded onto our YouTube soon. And there will be, you know, some avenues, you know, to contact Dr. Johnston if you have any follow-up questions. So again, thank you everyone so much. Have a good evening.
Thanks.